Dhaka was on fire. The city, usually bustling with life and energy, had turned into a battleground. Flames licked the sides of buildings, and the acrid smell of smoke filled the air. The once vibrant streets were now scenes of chaos and destruction. The heart of Bangladesh was bleeding. Fires burned everywhere. Tear gas filled the air, making it hard to breathe. The authorities, in a desperate attempt to control the situation, had unleashed a barrage of tear gas canisters. The white clouds of gas mingled with the black smoke from the fires, creating a suffocating atmosphere. People ran in all directions, trying to escape the choking fumes. A huge crowd of people filled the streets, their shouts for change echoing through the city. July 2024. Bangladesh exploded. The protests had started peacefully, but the frustration and anger of the people quickly turned them into something much more volatile. Banners and signs demanding justice and change were held high. As the voices of the masses grew louder and more insistent, the people had revolted. The government, desperate to stay in power, blamed someone else, the United States. In a bid to divert attention from their own failings, they pointed fingers at foreign powers, accusing them of inciting the unrest. Government officials held press conferences trying to convince the public that the chaos was not of their own making. They claimed a foreign power was causing the chaos, but the truth, hidden like the smoke in the air, was much more complicated. The real reasons for the uprising were deeply rooted in the country's own issues. Years of corruption, economic disparity, and political oppression had pushed the people to their breaking point. The smoke that filled the streets was a metaphor for the obscured truth. This wasn't a coup planned by another country. This was a people's revolution, driven by years of growing anger and economic hardship. The faces in the crowd told stories of struggle and resilience. The people of Dhaka, and indeed all of Bangladesh, had reached a tipping point. They were no longer willing to accept the status quo. This was their fight for a better future, a fight that had been a long time coming. The problem started long before the first firebomb was thrown. Sheikh Hasina's government had overseen economic growth, but only a few people benefited, not the majority. The gap between the rich and the poor grew bigger every year. Prices went up, making it harder for regular Bangladeshis to buy things. Higher fuel prices, a direct hit to the poorest people, became the match that lit the fire. For years, everyday Bangladeshis struggled to afford basic things. The cost of living has been a persistent issue, gnawing at the very fabric of society. People worked tirelessly, yet their earnings barely covered their needs. The struggle was real, and it was everywhere. The rising cost of living made it harder and harder. Every trip to the market was a reminder of how much more difficult life was becoming. Prices of essential goods like rice, vegetables, and cooking oil soared, leaving many to wonder how they would feed their families the next day. Things they used to be able to buy became too expensive. Shelves that once held affordable goods now displayed items with price tags that seemed out of reach. The sight of empty shelves became more common, a stark reminder of the growing scarcity. The fuel price increases in June 2024 were the last straw. The news spread like wildfire, and the discussions in tea shops and homes were filled with frustration and despair. The hike in fuel prices meant that everything else would become even more expensive. Transportation costs skyrocketed, hurting businesses and pushing families deeper into poverty. The government's response? Nothing. Silence. Small business owners watched helplessly as their customer base dwindled, unable to afford the increased costs of goods and services. And then, the explosion happened, just as everyone expected. It was a culmination of the pent-up frustration and anger. The streets, already tense with discontent, erupted in chaos. The explosion was both literal and metaphorical, signaling a breaking point.
The prices, they just kept going up. Every day, it seemed like there was a new increase. People were in disbelief, staring at price tags that seemed to mock their financial struggles. The cost of living was no longer just a challenge, it was a crisis. We couldn't buy anything anymore. The frustration was palpable. Shoppers walked through aisles with empty baskets, unable to afford the basics. The sense of helplessness grew, and with it a simmering anger. And when the gas prices went up, it was like the final punch. The queues at gas stations grew longer, and the prices displayed were almost unbelievable. It felt like a relentless assault on the people's ability to survive. We had nothing left to lose. The protests were inevitable. With nothing left to lose, people took to the streets, their voices rising in unison. The clenched fists in the air were a symbol of their determination and desperation. The tinderbox of discontent had finally ignited.
The government's bad economic decisions were only part of the problem. The streets of Bangladesh, once bustling with activity, now lay eerily quiet. Shops that used to be filled with customers are now empty, and the economic hardship is visible everywhere. People are struggling to make ends meet, and the sense of despair is palpable. Job quotas for government jobs, meant to help disadvantaged groups, became a way for powerful people to give jobs to their friends. These quotas, initially designed to uplift the marginalized, were manipulated by those in power. Instead of providing opportunities to the needy, they became tools of favoritism and nepotism. The frustration among job seekers grew, as they realized that merit had little to do with securing a position. Meanwhile, the police, who are supposed to keep the peace, became symbols of oppression. Clad in riot gear, they faced off against protesters, not as protectors, but as adversaries. The trust between the public and the police eroded rapidly. Instead of feeling safe, people felt threatened by those who were supposed to protect them. Stories of police brutality and unlawful killings were everywhere. Every day, new accounts of violence and abuse surfaced. Civilians showing their injuries became a common sight, and protests against police violence grew in number and intensity. The cries for justice echoed through the streets, but they often fell on deaf ears. People already struggling with money problems were stuck between a corrupt system and a violent police force. The economic strain was unbearable, and the added pressure of living under constant threat made life a nightmare. Families in poverty had to navigate a world where corruption was rampant, and the police, instead of being a source of security, were a source of fear.
The quotas were supposed to help the less fortunate, but instead, they became a way for the people in charge to help their friends. This betrayal of trust was a bitter pill to swallow for many. The disadvantaged, who had hoped for a fair chance, found themselves sidelined once again. Protests against this blatant misuse of power became more frequent as people demanded transparency and fairness. And the police, they weren't protecting us, they were hurting us. The scenes of police violence were harrowing. Protesters, who were merely exercising their right to speak out, were met with batons and tear gas. Detentions were arbitrary, and the fear of being targeted was ever present. The very institution meant to uphold the law was breaking it with impunity. It was a nightmare for everyone. The chaos and distress were overwhelming. People running away from the police, chaotic protest scenes, and the sheer desperation in the eyes of the protesters painted a grim picture. The hope for a better future seemed distant, and the present was a relentless struggle for survival.
As the protests grew bigger, the government, desperate to stay in control, used an old trick, blaming a foreign enemy.
The United States, with its history of getting involved in other countries' business, became the easy target.
Government-controlled news outlets told stories of American plots and schemes, trying to make the uprising look like something planned by foreigners.
But the proof just wasn't there.
The United States definitely has a long and complicated history of interfering in other countries. From South America to the Middle East, the memory of US-supported coups and regime changes still lingers. But what was happening in Bangladesh was very different from these past events. The protests started naturally, fueled by real complaints and a deep desire for change. The government's attempts to blame the United States for the uprising were both cynical and predictable. By talking about foreign interference, the government tried to do several things.
First, it let them avoid talking about their own mistakes and the real problems people had.
Second, it gave them a reason to crack down on the protests even harder. Even though the government tried to discredit the uprising and say it was a foreign plot, the people of Bangladesh won. The huge size of the protests, the unwavering commitment of the protesters, and the widespread criticism from around the world made it impossible for the government to stay in power. On August 5, 2024, Sheikh Hasina's government collapsed, bringing a new era of hope and uncertainty to Bangladesh. The July uprising showed how powerful people's movements can be. It proved that even against a very powerful government, regular citizens, working together for justice and a better future, can overthrow those in power. But Bangladesh faces many challenges ahead. The new government has the difficult job of rebuilding the country, fixing the problems of the past, and making the promises of the revolution a reality.